Hey everyone, you may recognise a familiar face.
Hello, professional fangirl. Kiran Millwood Hargrave here.
Kiran Millwood Hargrave is here. You may remember a couple of years ago now, I can't believe it's that long ago, Kiran and I did a little series of read-along vlogs to look at the original Philip Pullman trilogy, the Northern Lights trilogy, because Kiran was a huge fangirl, I had never read them, and so I read them, we got together and we sort of fangirled together about those books.
It was beautiful.
So we thought, let's get the band back together. Because we have approaching us rapidly the publication of the final part of the Wolf Hall trilogy.
Yay!
So Hilary Mantel's amazing chronicle of novels looking at the life of Thomas Cromwell concludes with The Mirror and the Light, and I have not read Wolf Hall or Bring Up the Bodies. I know.
What have you read?
I promise I've read loads of books, just not those ones. And the reason I suppose is actually that I am slightly resistant to historical novels. Many people have said to me over the years, but they're not like that. But these are the historical novels that you should read for that reason. And I've always gone, yeah, sure, great, sometime, yeah, maybe. And there's never enough time. But I've had to make time. And in fact, I have read them back to back. And we're here to talk about the first of them, Wolf Hall.
Yay!
First of all, maybe we should start with you, Kiran. You can tell me, what is it that you remember loving about reading these books originally, and particularly Wolf Hall?
So something I'm always looking for in a book and find very rarely is absolute immersion in a world, in a character, in a setting. And it's easy to sort of be swept along by a book. There are loads of amazing books that really sort of, they carry along. It's like a boat in a current, but there are very few that like hold you down in the water and they're like, this is all you are drinking from now on. And Wolf Hall and Bring Up the Bodies, which we'll be discussing later, really has that quality for me, where from the first moment that you meet Thomas Cromwell sort of bloodied at his father's boot in that yard, you're with him, you're in him, and it's a kind of inescapable. I mean, it's a tome, it's a brick, but it really did carry me along and through it. And it's the first time I could remember having that with a work of historical fiction, actually, and it had the quality of some really good contemporary fiction for that reason, is that it had this urgency, like I had to keep reading. And that's quite a feat when you could build a house from it.
Yeah, because I think it's about 650 pages, which is a big book.
Yeah.
I've read bigger books, so I'm not really, it's not so much the size. So you asked me what I'd read. I mean, because when you've read Moby Dick or War and Peace, and stuff, so it's not really the size, but it is just that thing of, do I really want to immerse myself in this world? And the thing that got me straight away, as you say, it's got this fantastic opening line and an opening scene. You are straight into the action, and the way that she does it is that she's written it in the present tense, which I wasn't expecting. And it took me a while to work out why is this so immediately engaging, and it's because you are looking almost I suppose you are looking through his eyes, but you're definitely on his shoulder, I think is probably a better way of describing it. And you are right there living it, rather than sort of looking back at what has happened in the past. And that immediacy is so engaging and compulsive, so that you want to turn pages to find out what happens next. And I suppose that leads on to the next thing that I loved about it, which is that, of course, these are novels of history and of the intrigue that surrounds historical events. And if you think about what you might remember from school, for me, not very much, about this period of history, there are a few little waymarkers that you might have. And what Mantel does is to fill in all of the gaps, and in fact, weirdly, often breeze over some of those big historical moments that you know from history. But what she's giving you is the conversation that happened before that and the conversation that happened after it. It's all about the spaces in between.
It's like, if you imagine a Tudor court, you've got that sort of central chamber where the king kind of inhabits, but it's always, and when I go to visit, palaces on school trips and things, it was always the corridors, the secret corridors that connected the palace, or it was where the servants' quarters were. And something that Hilary Mantel does so well is she captures that sort of labyrinthine quality of Tudor society at the time, and through this singular character manages to investigate all these spaces, because Cromwell becomes very important in the court, and you follow him through his ascendancy, so you get access to all these different levels that normally you don't get in historical fiction. They're normally either focusing on sort of ordinary people or they're focusing on royalty, but you really get this sort of sort of almost bird-like overview at the same time as creating this very intimate atmosphere through the conduit of Thomas Cromwell. I just think it's incredibly masterful, or mistressful, as a book. You know, it really is a writer at the top of her powers, with the ability to kind of capture all these nuances of a society without you feeling overwhelmed by it.
Yeah, and I think one of the ways she does that is that, of course, with this intrigue, there's a lot of conversation. There's a lot of speech in this book. And again, another bugbear from some historical fiction is that kind of milady sort of stuff where you're just like, I can't read a book that's going. Yeah, exactly. So the speech in it is modern speech. Yes, there are a few sort of Tudor moments to it, but actually, for the most part, it's very modern, contemporary language, and it means that again, you don't feel alienated from what's going on. You feel very much like you're listening in on conversations that you wouldn't normally have had access to, and that makes it as sort of propulsive as any contemporary thriller, or sort of, it's almost espionage-like in places, isn't it, where your sort of plots are being hatched.
That's completely it, I think, that you feel like you're privy to these shadowy conversations. And yeah, I think it is a really intelligent sort of way that she uses language. It's just as clear as it could be, like it's just people talking to each other.
Yeah.
And you know, there's no barrier between you as a contemporary reader and them sort of living in this time. It's also really funny in parts. Like, it's quite like there are like dirty jokes, and I really enjoy how she uses the humour both to kind of create some levity, but also sometimes it's quite threatening. And I think she manages to capture that texture, that kind of line between one minute you could be having a joke with the king and the next minute he's ordering your murder. So I think she captures that threat through humour really well.
Yeah. Another problem with historical fiction is where that research is just bashing you over the head repeatedly. She wears it very, very lightly.
There's no moment where it's like, oh, she really wanted to get that in because it's like a interesting to her. Like, there's nothing, she's like trimmed off all the excess. Like, it's just what you need to know, and also what Cromwell needs to know, because you're learning in this first book, you're learning the court with him. You know, he's not immediately, he's an incredibly intelligent man, and that's evident from the first few chapters, but he's learning and finding his feet in this world, and it's a very clever way to do it, is to kind of introduce him through this very sort of he's very new to this world, but also he's sort of got an old head on his shoulders, and I really enjoyed that, watching him make mistakes internally but actually externally not really putting a foot wrong.
He does. He has this sort of, again, another quality of him as a character is that he doesn't speak unless he has to. He knows to keep quiet until there's enough of a gap for him to actually say something.
Like a therapist.
And you can see that he's learning as he goes along. Having been quite, I suppose, an impetuous youth, he's what you get brilliantly is you get this kind of almost like a prologue at the beginning of his childhood and youth, and then there's this huge gap. He goes away and we don't know what happens to him, and then now that he's back in England in the court, you get to find out through this book, and indeed the next one, little bits about what happened to him whilst he was in Europe, and you kind of get the impression that some bad stuff happened, and he's just not the nicest guy. But he's also but he's very sympathetically portrayed in the book. I believe historically he's always been seen as a bit of a bastard
villain.
Very famous painting of him where he looks like a murderer. And indeed, that's one of the jokes. I think it's in this book, maybe it's in the second one, where he says, "I look like a murderer," and somebody says to him, "Did you not know?" Which is just a great joke. He has no idea that that's how he's seen by people.
And when he sees the portrait, and he does have this wonderful objectivity to him, where he sort of sees the portrait and he says, "It looks like I'm throttling those documents." And he's sort of releasing his hands, like, "Oh, yeah, that is how I hold documents." Stuff.
I feel I might have strayed us into the next book, so it's probably a good time to finish this vlog. As I say, for me as a newbie, 650 pages actually flew by. I found this immediately engaging and sort of page turning as I went through, so that I was able to literally finish it, put it down, pick up the next one and start again.
That's wonderful.
So that's what we'll do. We'll see you in a few weeks where we will talk about Bring Up the Bodies. Until then, take care.